The flashing blue lights hit my windows before I ever heard the sirens. Bright, pulsing reflections cutting through the quiet morning as officers stepped onto my driveway. And standing proudly beside them was Karen, pointing at my own truck parked in my own driveway, convinced she had finally caught me breaking a rule she invented. Before I explain how her lie dragged me all the way into a military command office, stay with me till the end. That morning began like any other, calm, slow, quiet. A thin layer of fog settled over the street, making the neighborhood look softer than usual. My truck sat in the driveway, engine cooling after I returned from an early shift. I had parked slightly diagonal, blocking the driveway entrance while reorganizing gear in the truck bed. It was my driveway, my vehicle, and a simple 10-minute task. I remember the smell of cold metal, diesel, and damp concrete as I shifted equipment. Nothing about the scene felt dramatic or confrontational. It was an ordinary moment, until I heard the quick, sharp footsteps approaching. The footsteps were familiar. That sharp heel-to-cement rhythm belonged to only one person, Karen, the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer of whatever rule she woke up believing existed. Her presence carried a strange tension, as if she viewed the entire neighborhood as a system she alone was destined to control. When she reached the end of my driveway, she didn't greet me or even acknowledge my presence. Instead, she stared at my truck as though it were some illegal barricade blocking a national highway. Her arms folded tightly across her chest, chin lifted, breath sharp, like she was preparing for a staged confrontation. I kept working, hoping she would simply move on. But Karen never moved on. She stepped closer, her voice slicing through the morning calm. "You can't block the street entrance," she said, although my truck wasn't in the street at all. It was angled across my driveway, not touching the curb, not in the road, not obstructing anyone. I explained that I was unloading gear and would be clear in a moment. But her eyes were already scanning for a violation she could cling to. She didn't want understanding. She wanted authority. And when she didn't find any real rule to invoke, she decided to invent one. She pulled out her phone with theatrical frustration, as if documenting evidence of a serious crime. "You're obstructing neighborhood access," she muttered loudly, loud enough for nearby houses to hear. The accusation was absurd. No one needed access. No vehicle was waiting. The entire street was empty. But her expression carried the certainty of someone determined to escalate. Then she said something that made me look up sharply. "If you don't move that truck right now, I'll call the police." Not HOA. Not a neighbor. Police. Over me, blocking my own driveway. It was the type of threat only someone drunk on false authority would make. I calmly repeated that I had full right to be there, that no access was obstructed, and that I'd be done shortly. But reason only fueled her indignation. She stepped back, lifted the phone, and, without hesitation, dialed. Her voice instantly shifted into frightened victim mode. "Yes, police? Someone is blocking our street intentionally. He's refusing to move. It's a safety issue." I felt a cold heaviness settle in my chest. She wasn't just twisting facts. She was manufacturing a false report. And in today's world, a false call, especially involving a uniformed service member, could spiral into something far more serious than a neighborhood disagreement. Minutes later, faint sirens began echoing from afar, growing louder as they approached. The flashing blue lights pierced through the morning haze, reflecting off my truck's windows in sharp, unsettling streaks. 2 patrol cars pulled up. Officers stepped out, scanning the area, expecting a confrontation, a hazard, maybe even a blocked emergency route. Instead, they found a quiet street, empty of traffic, with only me unloading gear beside my own vehicle. Karen rushed toward them, pointing dramatically at my truck. Her voice carried the urgency of a fabricated crisis. "There. He's blocking access and refusing to comply." The officers approached me carefully, not aggressively, but with the seriousness a dispatch call requires. They asked for my ID, which I provided calmly. They examined the truck, the driveway, and the street. Confusion flickered across their faces. Nothing illegal was happening. No obstruction. No public danger. No violation. One officer even stepped onto the street, tested visibility, and checked angles. Everything was clear. Their posture softened instantly. "Ma'am," one officer finally said to Karen, "this is his driveway. There is no obstruction." Her expression cracked for a moment, confusion turning into disbelief, then quickly into defensive irritation. But instead of backing down, Karen escalated. "He's in the military," she snapped. "He should know better than to disobey community rules." The officers exchanged glances. Her comment didn't just sound petty, it sounded targeted. And it wasn't lost on them. I felt my stomach clench. Bringing up my service was unnecessary. And dangerous. Because every call involving a service member becomes automatically documented. That meant a report would be forwarded, whether the incident was meaningful or not. The officer beside me sighed softly, almost apologetically. "Because she mentioned military status, we have to file a brief report. Nothing major. But it does get logged." The officers cleared me of wrongdoing, apologized for the inconvenience, and left. Karen, however, stormed off with the offended pride of someone whose illusion of power had been publicly dismantled. I finished unloading my gear in silence, the morning now feeling heavier than before. I didn't fear the police report, it held no violation. But the military's administrative system was precise. Even minor civilian complaints involving service members triggered automatic notifications. And deep down, I suspected that a summons was coming. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because protocol doesn't bend just because a civilian misused the system. By the afternoon, my suspicion became reality. An email popped up on my phone, "Report to Command Office, Supervisor Review." My chest tightened slightly, not in fear, but in frustration. A simple morning task had morphed into an official review because of one woman's obsession with controlling a neighborhood that didn't need controlling. I sat on the porch, watching the street grow quiet again. Fog lifted. Sun warmed the driveway. But something had shifted. Karen thought calling the police would intimidate me. Instead, she had triggered a chain of accountability she never expected, one that wouldn't stop with me. The morning after the police incident felt heavier than the quiet fog that hovered over our street. Although nothing in the neighborhood looked different, the same driveways, the same trimmed lawns, the same stillness, there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. I woke with a faint pressure in my chest, not from fear or guilt, but from the weight of a situation that shouldn't have existed to begin with. As I stepped outside, the memory of flashing blue lights returned like a cold aftertaste. My driveway, once just part of my home, now carried the echo of an unnecessary accusation. The neighbors had noticed. Their glances were quieter, longer, filled with questions they were hesitant to ask. Some looked sympathetic, others cautious, but nearly all of them had seen enough to understand that something wasn't right. I could feel the unspoken tension, an awareness that Karen's need for control had crossed a line. Still, no one wanted to involve themselves. HOAs had a reputation for making life difficult for anyone who challenged them. So people watched silently, pretending nothing had happened, while the truth hung in the air like humidity that refused to lift. By mid-morning, I sat inside reviewing the email again. "Report to Command Office, Supervisor Review." The wording wasn't hostile, but it carried the unmistakable tone of military protocol. Firm, neutral, procedural. There was no accusation, no warning, yet the formality alone was enough to make my stomach tighten. Not because I feared wrongdoing, but because unnecessary administrative scrutiny was something every service member avoided. The military runs on accountability, and even baseless civilian complaints create ripples. I reminded myself that honesty and documentation would carry me through, but the frustration burned beneath the surface. I gathered everything I needed: photos of my truck parked legally in my own driveway, security footage showing Karen approaching, audio of her fabricated emergency call, and a written summary of the events. As I organized the files, I felt a mix of irritation and disappointment. My time should have been spent on duty, training, or rest, not preparing evidence to defend myself from a false accusation made out of personal spite. The absurdity of it all sat heavy in my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an intentional escalation by someone who believed her authority outweighed common sense. When I finally stepped out to leave for the command office, I noticed something unexpected. Karen standing across the street, arms crossed tightly, watching me. Her expression was stiff, unreadable, but her posture held a strange mixture of defiance and unease. She didn't speak. She didn't approach. She simply observed, as if trying to gauge whether her actions had produced the reaction she intended. For a moment, our eyes met. There was no victory in hers, no satisfaction, only stubbornness wrapped in insecurity. She had started something she could no longer control, yet her pride wouldn't let her step back. Driving toward the base, I replayed the events in my mind. Her accusation, the police arrival, the officer's confusion, the unnecessary report triggered solely because she invoked my military status. The rhythm of the engine hummed beneath me, steady and grounding, but my thoughts drifted deeper. A part of me wondered why people like Karen felt so threatened by harmless things, why control mattered so much to them. Yet another part of me knew the answer: authority without boundaries becomes a craving. It becomes a lens through which everything looks like disobedience. And I had accidentally stepped into that lens. When I reached the base, the usual bustle of service members moving between buildings brought a sense of familiarity and grounding. The command office sat quiet, structured, disciplined, the opposite of the chaos Karen had stirred. Inside, a senior petty officer greeted me with a nod, not suspicion. "We just need clarification," he said calmly. His tone alone dissolved half the tension within me. He reviewed the documents, the security footage, and the officer's report. With each passing minute, I could see the skepticism fading, not toward me, but toward the civilian complaint that triggered the review. When the reviewing officer joined us, he was equally calm, measured, and strictly procedural. He asked all the necessary questions. Was I blocking public access? Was there any confrontation? Did I disregard police instructions? Every answer was clear, clean, supported by evidence. When he finally leaned back in his chair, he exhaled slowly. "This is civilian misuse of emergency services," he said. "You acted within your rights." The relief didn't come in a wave, it came subtly, settling over me like warm air replacing cold. Still, before dismissing me, the officer added something unexpected. "We'll be filing a note regarding the civilian caller. There are protocols for false reports, especially when they target a service member." His tone held a quiet firmness, the kind that implied consequences Karen wasn't anticipating. I walked out of the office feeling lighter but thoughtful. The military wouldn't retaliate, but they wouldn't ignore the misuse of emergency channels either. Justice in uniform moves carefully, deliberately, but it moves. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. The issue was no longer just between me and Karen. She had escalated it into a wider circle. Driving back home, the neighborhood looked the same as always. Quiet street, trimmed lawns, the rustle of leaves under a mild afternoon breeze. Yet I felt a shift beneath the surface. Karen had weaponized authority she never actually possessed. She had twisted a normal morning into a police incident and then triggered a military review, believing nothing would come back to her. But life doesn't work that way. Actions echo. And her echo was already on its way. As I parked my truck, the street felt strangely still. A sense of unfolding justice settled into the air, quiet, slow, inevitable. The day after my command review, the neighborhood carried a strange, unsettled quiet, like the pause between two waves before the next one hits. Nothing visibly dramatic had happened yet, but something in the air felt altered, heavy, waiting, charged. As I stepped onto the porch with my coffee, the street looked almost too still, as though every house was holding its breath. The breeze was soft, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the low hum of distant traffic. Ordinary sounds, normal scenery. Yet underneath it all was the awareness that a decision had been set in motion far beyond Karen's understanding. I checked my email out of habit, expecting nothing unusual. But a new message from the base liaison office sat at the top of my inbox. The subject line was simple: Civilian Report Follow-Up. Inside, the message clarified that the incident had been forwarded to a civilian military coordination unit responsible for monitoring false emergency calls, especially those targeting service members. They didn't blame me. They didn't question me. They didn't even require additional documentation. Instead, they confirmed that the misuse of emergency resources would be reviewed formally. A slow, steady realization settled inside me. The consequences of Karen's call had officially begun. Around midday, I stepped outside to move my truck. As I backed into the driveway, I noticed a familiar figure standing on the sidewalk 2 houses down. Karen. But something about her posture was different. Her arms weren't crossed. She wasn't storming forward. Instead, she stood unusually still, shoulders tense, eyes tracking my movement with a mixture of suspicion and something else, uncertainty. For the first time since this feud began, she didn't stride toward me. She didn't bark instructions. She didn't accuse me of anything. She simply watched, and the silence between us felt sharper than any argument. Later that afternoon, a neighbor I'd only spoken to once came walking across the street. He hesitated before speaking, glancing around as if checking whether anyone was listening. "Hey, I heard something you should know," he said quietly. He explained that whispers were spreading through the neighborhood, that the HOA board had been contacted by an external agency asking about the false police call. The news had shaken the board. Members weren't used to being questioned, let alone by anyone outside the community. "Whatever she was trying to do," he added, "it's turning on her now." Then he walked away quickly. By evening, the tension became nearly visible. Neighbors stood on porches longer than usual, glancing between my house and Karen's. Some gave small, supportive nods. Others avoided eye contact altogether, as though afraid of being pulled into the gravity of the situation. The HOA clubhouse, usually quiet on weekdays, had its lights on early. Through the windows, I could see silhouettes, board members leaning over tables, pacing, pointing at documents. Something was happening inside those walls. Something they hadn't planned for. Karen had acted alone, but now the entire board was being pulled into the weight of her decision. A few hours later, a soft knock broke the stillness of my living room. When I opened the door, I found a man in his late 50s, another HOA board member, someone I'd seen at meetings but never spoken to. He held a folder in his hand, his expression marked by reluctant responsibility. "We'd like to request a copy of any documentation regarding the incident," he said quietly, eyes lowered. His tone wasn't aggressive. It wasn't defensive. It was cautious, like someone forced into damage control. I handed him printed copies without commentary. He nodded, avoided eye contact, and walked away quickly. That night, the clubhouse lights stayed on past 10 p.m. Through the blinds, faint shadows signaled a heated discussion. Voices rose, muffled but tense. Papers shuffled. Chairs moved. Every sound hinted at panic, an HOA thrown into chaos not by me, but by the consequences of one person's reckless false report. And yet, I didn't feel triumph. I felt something heavier, something more sobering. The situation had gone far beyond a neighborhood disagreement. It was now a documented misuse of emergency services. It was now under review by authorities who didn't tolerate fabricated accusations, especially against uniformed personnel. The next morning brought confirmation. A letter was slipped under my door, this time from the HOA, not Karen. The tone was drastically different from their usual confident notices. This one was formal, cautious, almost apologetic. They acknowledged concerns raised regarding protocol in handling community conflicts, and stated that an internal review had begun. They emphasized the need for accurate reporting to emergency services, and expressed a desire to avoid future misunderstandings. Not once did they mention Karen by name, but the implication was unmistakable. The board was bracing for fallout and trying to shield themselves as best they could. When I stepped outside later, the neighborhood felt like a place holding its breath. Even the weather seemed to match the mood, the sky overcast, the air thick and unmoving. Karen's curtains were drawn tight, unusually so, as though she didn't want to face the outside world. For the first time, she wasn't patrolling the sidewalks or waving her clipboard like a badge. She had vanished into silence. The same woman who once strutted through the neighborhood dictating imaginary rules now couldn't even look toward the street she once controlled. And the absence of her presence spoke louder than her voice ever had. As the day faded and porch lights flicked on across the street, a quiet certainty settled inside me. The consequences she set in motion were no longer under anyone's control. Not mine, not the HOA's, and certainly not hers. The police report, the command review, the external inquiry, it had all formed a chain reaction she never expected. Actions echo. And hers were echoing farther and louder than she imagined. This chapter of the conflict wasn't just about justice beginning to move. It was about accountability finally stepping into a place where it had long been missing. And the full outcome was still approaching. The next morning dawned colder than usual, a sharp breeze pushing through the neighborhood like a quiet reminder that some things had shifted permanently. As I stepped outside, I sensed a different kind of silence, one that didn't feel empty but expectant. The street, once shaped by Karen's constant circling and inspecting, now stood strangely free of her presence. The air smelled crisp, carrying hints of damp asphalt and something else, a feeling almost like relief. A subtle calm had begun settling over the neighborhood, though no one fully acknowledged it. But beneath that calm, the wheels of real accountability were turning. Around 9 a.m., a dark sedan turned slowly into the neighborhood, unfamiliar yet official-looking. It didn't belong to any resident. The tinted windows and methodical pace suggested a purpose beyond a casual visit. The car stopped near the HOA clubhouse. Two individuals stepped out, plain clothes, professional posture, folders in hand. They walked with quiet authority, the kind that didn't need introduction. Neighbors who happened to be outside paused mid-step. A few pretended not to notice but still watched closely from the corners of their eyes. This wasn't normal HOA business. Something official had arrived. The visitors disappeared inside the clubhouse, closing the door gently behind them. Through the blinds, faint movement began, a nervous shifting of silhouettes, papers being handled, chairs scraping softly. Whatever conversation was taking place inside wasn't casual. After a few minutes, Karen's car rolled slowly up the street. She stepped out with hesitation, not her usual stomping stride. She carried no clipboard. Her hands looked stiff, her expression tight. She paused before entering the clubhouse, took a deep breath, then vanished inside. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, a tense vibration settled over the neighborhood. For nearly an hour, the clubhouse remained closed. The blinds barely shifted, but every so often a muffled voice rose, quickly subdued. I didn't need to hear the words to understand the gravity. This wasn't a friendly HOA meeting, nor a simple debrief. This was questioning, formal, structured, unavoidable. The kind that demanded honesty and documentation. The kind that left no room for manufactured narratives. Whatever Karen had initiated with her false police call had now reached a level she could no longer maneuver around. She wasn't the one controlling the situation anymore. She had become the subject of it. When the door finally opened, Karen stepped out first. Her face was pale, her eyes sharp but unfocused, like someone who had been forced to confront a truth they had spent years avoiding. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't scan the street for violations. She walked straight to her car with a stiffness that looked almost brittle. Moments later, the two officials exited calmly, talking quietly among themselves before driving away without urgency. Their departure felt symbolic. The necessary message had been delivered, the necessary warnings issued, and the consequences set in motion. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet force of procedure. By noon, a neighborhood email arrived. Not from Karen. Not from the usual HOA address. It came from the board vice president, someone who rarely communicated directly. The message was formal, cautious, and clearly drafted under guidance. It acknowledged an ongoing review involving a recent emergency call and emphasized the HOA's commitment to cooperating with external authorities. The wording avoided specifics, but everyone understood. Karen's call had not only been false, it had triggered an official inquiry. And now the board was attempting to distance itself from her actions before the fallout reached them too. The shift was immediate. Neighbors who once avoided involvement now stepped outside with slightly more confidence, exchanging quiet glances that held understanding. Some offered small nods in my direction. Not sympathy, recognition. They had watched Karen control this neighborhood for so long that seeing her authority falter felt surreal. A few whispered among themselves, their voices carrying fragments of speculation. Consequences, suspension, removal. Even those who once supported her strictness now seemed uneasy, as if realizing too late that blind enforcement without accountability is dangerous, not orderly. Karen, however, remained invisible for most of the day. Her curtains stayed closed. Her driveway empty. No clipped footsteps. No patrol of self-given authority. The woman who once moved like she owned the street now seemed to shrink from it. But guilt wasn't the emotion radiating from her house. It was fear. Fear not of me, not of the neighborhood's whispers, but of the unstoppable administrative mechanism she had set off with one false phone call. Military and civilian investigations were slow but thorough. And she knew it. She had crossed a boundary she could no longer deny existed. By late afternoon, another letter appeared in my mailbox, this one stamped with a formal insignia. Inside, the tone was clear and professional. The review of Karen's call had escalated beyond a simple reprimand. The misuse of emergency services, the targeted nature of the accusation, and the mention of my military status during the call had raised concerns of harassment. They assured me the investigation would continue regardless of my involvement. I wasn't required to testify. My documentation had already spoken for me. Justice was moving, not loudly, not aggressively, but with the quiet precision of a system built to address wrongdoing. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the neighborhood settled under a soft golden haze, I stood on my porch watching shadows stretch across the quiet street. A sense of deep clarity filled me. Karen had always believed that raising her voice, enforcing imaginary rules, and calling authorities would bend the world to her will. But entitlement only survives as long as it goes unchallenged. Now that challenge had arrived, not from anger or retaliation, but from truth. And truth, once awakened, doesn't retreat. The shift had begun. And its final resolution was approaching with steady, undeniable momentum. The morning after the official's visit felt noticeably different. Lighter, clearer, as if the entire neighborhood had exhaled overnight. A soft golden light spilled over the rooftops, warming the pavement and dissolving the cold tension that had lingered for days. When I stepped outside, the breeze carried a calmness that had been missing for far too long. The street looked peaceful, ordinary, alive again, not frozen under the weight of one person's authority. Still, beneath the stillness, a quiet anticipation fluttered. Everyone sensed the final outcome was close. Not dramatic, not loud, just inevitable, shaped by consequences already set in motion. Around mid-morning, another official vehicle arrived, not marked, but clearly government-issued. A single officer stepped out carrying a sealed envelope. He approached my house with a respectful nod. "Follow-up notice," he said. His tone carried no alarm. It was simply procedural. After he left, I stood by the doorway for a moment, feeling the weight of the envelope. When I opened it, the message was direct. The civilian caller, Karen, had been formally cited for misuse of emergency services, with the potential for additional penalties pending review. They thanked me for cooperating and reaffirmed that I had done nothing wrong. It felt like closure beginning. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than the breeze that rustled the trees. People didn't speak loudly, but the murmurs carried, soft, clipped, filled with disbelief. Karen's name surfaced in half-whispers as residents stepped onto porches or gathered near driveways. Not with cruelty, but with astonishment. 4 years, she had ruled with rigid insistence, hiding behind the HOA's authority to justify every accusation, every confrontation. But now, the shield she relied on had cracked. Her misuse of emergency resources wasn't a rumor anymore. It was documented, official, visible. And the fallout was no longer speculation but fact. By noon, the HOA sent another email, far more direct than previous ones. They confirmed Karen's temporary suspension from all HOA duties pending external review outcomes. They emphasized a commitment to fairness, accuracy, and proper reporting procedures. The tone was almost desperate, as if distancing themselves from her actions could repair their reputation. The message ended with a note encouraging neighbors to report concerns responsibly. It was ironic, an HOA lecturing the community on responsible reporting after enabling the very behavior they now condemned. But change, even imperfect, was still change. And it was happening at last. Later that afternoon, I saw Karen's car leave her driveway. Slowly, cautiously. When she stepped out at the end of the street to collect her mail, her posture was nothing like the woman who once patrolled the sidewalks with authority. She looked smaller, subdued, almost lost in a space she used to dominate. For the first time, she glanced toward my house, not with anger, but with something closer to resignation. There was no confrontation in her eyes, no attempt to justify her actions. Just the weight of consequences settling around her. And in that moment, I felt no triumph, only clarity. Justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like realization. And watching Karen, it was clear she had finally met the boundary she believed did not apply to her. She wasn't the victim of a misunderstanding. She was the architect of her own downfall. Her decisions, fueled by pride, entitlement, and a hunger for control, had finally collided with reality. And reality didn't bend. It held firm. She walked back to her house slower than she had come out, shoulders slumped slightly, as though the air felt heavier around her. Change begins quietly. Sometimes painfully. But always inevitably. Toward evening, another letter arrived, this one addressed to the entire community. The board announced new guidelines involving emergency calls, emphasizing that false or exaggerated reports would no longer be tolerated. They also implemented new training requirements for HOA members on recognizing legal boundaries and interacting respectfully with residents. The reforms were thorough, clearly shaped by external pressure. It struck me how one incident, one false call, had exposed a flaw in the system deep enough to force structural change. It wasn't about me versus Karen anymore. It was about the community finally acknowledging the damage caused by unchecked authority. As the sun dipped lower, casting long amber shadows across the street, neighbors approached me, carefully at first, then more openly. Some apologized for staying silent. Others thanked me for handling everything calmly. A few simply said they were relieved it was over. Their words weren't dramatic, but they carried sincerity. This wasn't just about conflict, it was about a neighborhood learning what accountability looks like. And ironically, the person who had tried so hard to enforce order had become the reason true order was being restored. Justice had arrived, not through confrontation, but through clarity, documentation, and consequence. That night, when I sat on the porch with the cool breeze brushing across my shoulders, I realized the story had come full circle. The place where I once stood explaining my own driveway to police officers was now quiet, calm, unthreatening. The same neighbors who once watched nervously now waved with ease. And Karen's house, once the center of scrutiny, sat quiet behind its drawn curtains. Not in triumph or shame, but in reflection. She wasn't destroyed, she was confronted. And sometimes, confrontation is the most powerful form of justice life can deliver. When I finally stepped inside and closed the door behind me, a deep sense of closure settled in. I hadn't sought revenge. I hadn't demanded consequences. I had simply stood my ground with truth. And truth had carried its own weight, slowly, steadily, undeniably. Karen's false accusation had backfired not because of anger, but because accountability found its path. And as the house grew quiet and the street outside mellowed into darkness, one thought echoed in my mind with absolute clarity. When someone tries to weaponize authority, the truth eventually becomes the force that disarms them.